dominant military strategist who penned one of the greatest works of art, and a figure that will forever go down in history as one of legends. But is he exactly that? A myth forever bound to history as an enigma who had then been reborn as a meme? The legend of Sun Tzu isn't just a mystery of whether or not he wrote The Art of War, but rather if he had existed at all. Historical accounts of his legends do exist, but to prove that they are true, as many scholars have tried in the past centuries, is difficult, and none have seemingly succeeded. The main point in question was that Sun Tzu was never once mentioned in the Book of Zhuozuan, a historical encyclopedia born in the 4th century BC that chronicled the Zhao dynasty from 722 BC to 468. Being such a prolific military strategist and seeing how the state of Wu was in a constant struggle for power, Sun Tzu should have been countlessly quoted and named in such texts, yet he was missing. But the juice of this multi-layered onion does not stop there. Another monumental historical manuscript written 300 years after the Zhuozuan, named the Shiji, does in fact mention Sun Tzu. And not only does it mention Sun Tzu, but attributed him to many advancements in military strategy as well as tales of absolute dominance. Such tales will be explored later on in this video. If taken at face value, Sun Tzu and his accomplishments can be seen as a fantastical fairy tale that came during later dynasties, romanticizing the spring and autumn period. But such fabrication is as difficult to prove as it is to disprove. Another theory is that the art of war itself may really just be a collection of individual teachings and lessons from military scholars. The theory states that the scriptures written on bamboo were just key transcribed lessons and conversations between King Wu and his advisors, then passed down generations through word of mouth, and finally immortalized in bamboo through scholars at the time who pieced together the information and combined it into a singular work, attributing it to a son of Wu as a pseudonym. No matter the author, the art of war is at its core 13 dominant military concepts that when put to use can achieve astounding results that we'll get into later. Even with the passage of time and how new military strategies develop and evolve, the 13 ancient teachings did absolutely change the tide of war for many. The use of these 13 lessons and the ability to faithfully execute them can dramatically increase the chances of victory. One defining example of this was the rise of Wu and its commanding victories that supposedly happened under Sun Tzu's advisory, and the subsequent Battle of Boju that followed. The previously mentioned colossal recollection of Chinese history named the Records of the Grand Historian, or Shiji, written by Sima Qian from the Han Dynasty, has a chapter titled The Biography of Sun Tzu, in which King Hilu of Wu was quoted saying, quote, "I have seen all 13 chapters of the book from Sun Tzu." Sima Qian then describes the events that supposedly happened before King Hilu eventually hired Sun as a military advisor. Details of these accounts cannot be verified other than the writings in this book, but it goes as follows. King Hilu was looking for a military advisor, and being the scrappy young military strategist that Sun Tzu was at the time, he took up the challenge of training concubines to be as good as real soldiers as a test for the king. Sun divided the 180 concubines of the palace into two, led by their own respective captains. He then proceeded to give out commands to the teams and watch as they understood his directions. Though when it came time to perform, the ladies were playful and unwilling to execute the commands. This, according to Sun and his principles in the art of war, was a grievous sin. If soldiers in the army understand the command but refuse to obey, then the burden of failure rests on the commanding officer, as the duty of a general is to perform his mission unbeholden to anyone who may try to dissuade. To showcase how dedicated he was to the craft of military excellence, Sun Tzu beheaded the two concubines as they failed to keep their respective regiments on task, much to the king's despair. Sun Tzu understood the fact that the king and his advisors were capable of being idealistic and understanding of the concepts of war, but incapable of executing the required steps necessary to win real wars. This prompted the king to see the value in having a military expert capable of actually executing the tactics and strategies of warfare, and so he was promptly hired. The state of Wu eventually prospered and won countless battles with their neighboring states, and proceeded to gain infamy in their trials for power, due in no small part to the contributions of Sun Tzu and his teachings. One of the most decisive battles during this era can be heavily attributed to the workings of Sun Tzu, although many may argue that this battle cannot be attributed to Sun, as his name does not appear in the historical documents of the Zuozuan. The counter-argument can be said that he does appear in the Shiji. No matter which book you believe, the Battle of Boju is a tale of dominance and utter humiliation for the receiving army, and one that has stood the test of time as the epitome of military excellence. Spurred on by their recent successes in attacking the much larger state of Chu, the kingdom of Wu decided it was time and launched an all-out offensive. This attack was the culmination of a 6-year plan to whittle down and demoralize the state of Chu. At the start of the plan in 512 BC, Sun Tzu was depicted to have been against an invasion at the time, as morale was low and the preparations were not ready. Carefully throughout the next 6 years, Wu Shizu, another brilliant military strategist for the Wu kingdom, devised a plan to dismantle the will of Chu by the power of constant harassment. The strategy involved splitting up the primary army force into 3 separate battalions and using them to launch a constant barrage of attacks on Chu in order to slowly pressure them into a sense of frustration, while exploiting their weak points to build new tactics and strategies for an all-out war. Seeing this and being decidedly fed up with encroachment and blackmail, the vassal state of Kai rebelled, joining forces with Wu to put an end to what they thought of as a never-ending nightmare. Their combined forces, while impressive, were still small in comparison to the manpower that Chu had possessed. But one thing that Chu had failed to capitalize on was the careful planning of battle, and how important it was to have high morale and soldiers willing to fight for something they cared deeply about. This lack of morale will soon bear itself as a painful lesson for Chu. During the dawn of 506 BC, King Hilu seized the opportunity of attack and personally led the army alongside Wu Shizu, his younger brother Fu Gai, and Sun Tzu, up the Huai River in preparation. As a countermeasure to this, Shen Yin, a commander for Chu, decided to strategize a flank to trap and attack Wu forces from all sides. Not wanting to cede glory and power, Nang Hua of Chu decided to go against this and launch an all-out offensive on Wu. This costly mistake would make way for Wu to win the next 3 consecutive battles, and this drastically shifted the momentum of battle, and defeat looked imminent for Chu. But after being called a mockery by an advisor named Shi Huang for wanting to retreat and flee his position, Na Wang decided to advance ahead and prepare for the penultimate battle at Boju. On the 19th day of the 11th month, the 2 armies were readying themselves for a confrontation that they knew would end with a victor. Knowing how desperate the Chu soldiers were for relief, Fu Gai disobeyed his brother's orders and commanded his own 5,000-strong army to attack the disheartened forces of Chu. Dazed and confused, the warriors of Chu were routed and sent scurrying away to the Qingfa River, with Nang Hua fleeing his position to seek safety in a neutral city-state. The forces of Wu followed, but decided to hold off an attack until half of the opposing forces had crossed the river, as soldiers who knew of retreat would not fight to their deaths. This plan worked flawlessly, and again the forces of Chu were forced to further retreat, but upon resting, the Wu army caught them by surprise, forcing yet another hurried retreat, and leaving behind provisions that were then placed into the hands of Wu. The newly revitalized soldiers of Wu gave chase, and the 2 armies met at the Yangtze River, and there, with the army of Chu completely and utterly demoralized, fell swiftly in battle. Knowing what lay ahead, the Wu army marched into Ying, the capital of Chu, and from there declared victory. This entire chain of events was a real lesson on how the usage of all passages from the Art of War can absolutely change the tide of battle, no matter the validity of its sources. To many, Sun Tzu is an absolute hero who penned the strategic masterpiece of war, while to others he remains an enigmatic legend, lost to the cruel fate of time, without any way to verify his otherworldly accomplishments. With the uncovering of both the Art of War attributed to Sun Tzu and Sun Bin's Art of War in 1972, we can positively say that both pieces of literature have been in fact written in ancient China, with the wisdom contained in them being used and iterated upon through decades of warring states. What we cannot confirm is the validity of Sun Tzu as a person, his linealogy, and if he were a physical being at all and not just a collection of notes and thoughts. This video may not have all the answers, but what I do know is that the two differing accounts of the Zuozuan and the Shiji are still being debated to this day. With the limited amount of information that we have, the only person that can tell you if Sun Tzu truly did exist is you. But no matter if he did, the teachings and the stories associated with such legends are indeed powerful tools that can help us on our own journey, and to leave our marks on the seemingly never-ending and cruel passage of time.